Usually when you walk into a grocery store, you expect a certain rhythm, like a
Right.
predictability.
It's very routine.
Exactly. You grab a plastic clamshell of strawberries, you toss it on the belt, you scan the barcode at the register, and it beeps. You pay, you walk out, and you probably never think about that transaction again.
Yeah.
It is utterly mundane.
Well, and it is entirely by design.
Mm.
I mean, we have spent the last 70 years building a global economy specifically optimized to make that transaction as frictionless and honestly as unthinking as possible.
Yeah.
The entire system is built to hide the staggering complexity that's, happening behind the scenes.
But when you actually start looking at the mechanics of global macroeconomics, and specifically the shipping and supply chain data we're digging into today, that simple barcode beep tells a completely different story.
Oh, absolutely.
It reveals this incredibly fragile, invisible thread. A thread that stretches from your grocery cart across oceans and, right now, directly into the middle of a conflict zone.
Which brings us to the core tension of the modern world, really. It's the battle between efficiency and resilience. We optimize for peace, basically assuming the system would never truly be tested.
And now,
Now that assumption is collapsing in real time.
it really is. So welcome to another deep dive. We had a highly critical mission today. We are sorting through a massive stack of economic reports, shipping manifests, and market data detailing the global fallout of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war against Iran.
Yeah, a lot of data to get through.
For context, as of today, April 2026, this conflict has been active for over a month. And our objective is to chart the exact mathematical and logistical path of how a regional war metastasizes into a worldwide cost of living crisis.
And the speed of that metastasis is what catches people completely off guard.
Absolutely. Now, before we get into the actual mechanisms, let's establish exactly how we're approaching this.
Right, ground rules.
Yeah, because when you look at the raw data coming out of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, setting aside all the heavy politics, the emotional weight, and just looking purely at the math of global supply chains, the numbers are staggering.
They really are.
So we're looking strictly at the factual economic impacts and logistical disruptions detailed in these sources. There is no endorsing of military viewpoints here, no weighing in on geopolitical motives.
We're just looking at the logistics.
Exactly. We are tracking the physics of global trade under extreme duress.
What's fascinating here is that when people hear about this war, they picture missiles and breaking news banners. But the real story is much bigger. It's about a tiny strip of water that dictates the price of your groceries and the availability of the microchips in your electronics.
Okay, let's start right there with a brief overview. Looking at the Strait of Hormuz right now, we all know it is the primary geopolitical choke point, but the physical scale of the current bottleneck is it's truly unprecedented.
The geography is just unforgiving. I mean, you have this incredibly narrow waterway linking the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and ultimately, the global ocean.
Right.
At its narrowest, it is only about 21 miles wide. But the shipping lanes themselves, like the deep water channels required for massive supertankers, are only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles, that's nothing.
It's basically a highway.
And the players relying on those 2 miles of deep water read like a who's who of global energy. You've got Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and of course, Iran.
Yeah, and in a normal environment, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply flows through that microscopic bottleneck.
1/5 of all oil.
1/5 of the energy required to keep human civilization humming, squeezed through a channel you could honestly run across in an afternoon if it were solid ground.
Okay, let's unpack this,
Yeah.
because I think we need an analogy here. Think of the Strait of Hormuz not just as a shipping lane, but as the main artery of the global industrial body.
I like that.
Right. And if you pinch that artery, the whole body doesn't just feel a little pinch. Major organs immediately start shutting down because they are starved of oxygen. And in this case, that oxygen is energy.
That's exactly right. And according to our sources, Iran has effectively closed the strait, creating what the International Energy Agency, the IEA, calls the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
History, not just recent history.
All right, but let's look at what that actually means on the water, because closing a strait isn't just putting up a stop sign. It creates a massive physical traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions.
Yeah, because the ships don't just disappear.
Exactly. You have to picture the vessels involved. We are talking about very large crude carriers, or VLCCs.
VLCCs.
Yeah. These ships are 3 football fields long. They carry 2 million barrels of oil each.
Wow. 2 million.
per ship. And right now, hundreds of these behemoths are completely stranded. They are fully loaded with crude, sitting low in the water, trapped inside the Persian Gulf.
And because they can't leave, the local storage capacity onshore in the Gulf states is, well, it's filling up at a terrifying rate.
Which introduces a fascinating and deeply problematic mechanical issue.
Because you can't just turn the oil off.
Right. You cannot just flip a switch and turn off an oil well when your storage tanks are full. Oil reservoirs are highly pressurized geological formations.
So there's physical pressure pushing the oil up.
Yes. If you abruptly shut in a well, you risk permanently damaging the reservoir pressure, meaning, you might never get that same level of production back when you eventually reopen it.
Oh, wow. So you break the well.
Potentially, yeah. So producers are playing this agonizing game of slowing production to a crawl while frantically looking for any available floating bathtub to store the excess.
The pressure backing up into the system is just immense.
Yeah.
But to truly grasp the scale of this blocked artery, you have to look at the immediate real-world symptoms breaking out across the globe right now.
We have to follow the shockwaves.
Exactly. Which leads us directly into examining where the pain is being felt most acutely, these notable cases.
Right. So the first, most obvious layer of this shockwave is the energy sector. This is where the initial financial panic materializes into hard numbers.
And the figures are jarring. I mean, Brent crude, which is the main global benchmark for oil, recently shot up to $116 a barrel.
Yeah.
It is pacing for a record 60% monthly increase. And analysts in our stack of sources are projecting that if the war persists through June, oil could reach $200 a barrel.
Which is just astronomical.
And it is not just oil. The Dutch TTF gas benchmark, which is basically the baseline for European natural gas, has essentially doubled since the conflict started.
But we have to separate the financial panic, like the traders bidding up the price of paper contracts, from the actual physical destruction of infrastructure.
Because the infrastructure damage is permanent.
Yes, the latter is far more permanent.
You were talking about the attacks on Qatar's facilities.
Exactly. The sources detailed that Iranian attacks have knocked out 17% of Qatar's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, export capacity.
Okay, let's explain why that specific percentage is so devastating. Because LNG isn't like pumping crude oil into a metal barrel.
No, not at all. The physics of LNG are incredibly demanding. Natural gas takes up an enormous amount of space. So to ship it across an ocean, you have to shrink it.
Right.
You do that by supercooling the gas to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wait, negative 260?
Yes, which turns it into a liquid and reduces its volume by a factor of 600.
That is wild. But achieving negative 260 degrees at an industrial scale, I mean, that requires a massive, complex labyrinth of cryogenic engineering.
It really does. It requires specialized metals that don't shatter at extreme cold, massive turbine compressors, intricate piping.
So it's delicate.
Highly delicate. When a facility like that is hit by military munitions, you are not sending in a crew to weld a patch over a weekend. You have to fabricate highly specialized replacement parts that only a few companies on Earth even know how to make.
So how long does it take to fix?
The estimates suggest that replacing that 17% of Qatar's capacity could take up to 5 years.
5 years. Wow. 5 years of a tighter global gas market permanently baked into the system, regardless of when the war ends.
Exactly.
Now, while this is a global crisis, the pain isn't distributed evenly, right? The geography of global trade dictates who gets hit first. And right now, Asia is taking the absolute brunt of the physical shortages.
It makes sense when you track the maritime routes. 80% of the oil flowing out of Hormuz goes east to Asia.
80%.
Yeah. Asian economies are the factory floor of the world, and that entire floor is powered by Middle Eastern hydrocarbons. They sit at the very end of a hyper-vulnerable supply chain.
Let's look at how this is forcing drastic behavioral changes in real time, just to make it concrete for you listening.
Yeah.
Take South Korea.
A huge industrial hub.
Right. They rely on the Middle East for 70% of their crude oil. The government hasn't just issued warnings. They have implemented hard public sector curbs on energy usage. Furthermore, they are debating extending driving restrictions to the general public.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
For a highly industrialized, export-driven economy like South Korea home, to massive conglomerates that require immense energy for manufacturing, telling citizens they might be legally barred from driving their cars on certain days, is a profound economic handbrake.
Then you look at an island nation like the Philippines. They are 98% reliant on imported energy. 98. They have declared a formal national energy emergency
Island grids are uniquely fragile.
because they're isolated.
Exactly. If you are in Europe and a port goes down, you can theoretically import power from a neighboring country's grid or, truck fuel across a land border.
Right.
In the Philippines, every single megawatt of backup thermal power requires a physical ship to arrive in port and unload. When the ships stop, the grid simply dies. Rolling blackouts become the default state.
And Sri Lanka is another severe case. Our sources note they have literally altered their calendar, making every Wednesday a public holiday, specifically to force people to stay home.
Just to reduce fuel consumption for commuting.
Exactly. That is alongside strict fuel rationing at the pumps.
It is a desperate measure that fundamentally shrinks their gross domestic product. You are mandating a reduction in economic activity just to preserve the fuel needed for critical emergency services and food transport.
In Thailand, the mandates are hitting the workplace. Mandatory work-from-home orders where possible, and for essential offices, a strict mandate to keep air conditioning on low.
Which, in a tropical climate, severely impact productivity.
Absolutely. And in India, which is arguably the most complex logistical environment on the planet, severe shortages of cooking gas are hitting households directly.
The Indian cooking gas dynamic is crucial to understand. We are talking about liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG cylinders. Millions of rural and semi-urban households rely on these for daily survival.
It's how they cook their food.
Yes. And when LPG shipments from the Middle East halt, those distribution networks dry up almost instantly, forcing people back to burning biomass like wood or dung, which has massive health and environmental knock-on effects.
Okay, so that is the energy layer. But here is where it gets really interesting and much more alarming. Because energy is just the opening act. The second layer of this crisis moves from the gas tank to the dinner table.
Food supply.
Yes, natural gas is the literal physical foundation of modern food production.
I think people often assume the connection between oil and food is just, the diesel in the farmer's tractor or the fuel for the delivery truck.
I know I did. But it is so much deeper than that. We are talking about the chemistry of fertilizer.
Specifically, nitrogen-based fertilizers like ammonia and urea. The defining agricultural breakthrough of the 20th century was the Haber-Bosch process.
Right, Haber-Bosch.
Yeah. To make plants grow at the scale required to feed 8 billion people, you need to inject massive amounts of nitrogen into the soil.
Now, there's plenty of nitrogen in the air around us, but plants can't access it, right?
Exactly. The nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere are locked together with an incredibly strong triple chemical bond. The Haber-Bosch process uses extreme heat and extreme pressure to break that bond and attach the nitrogen to hydrogen.
And where do we get the vast quantities of hydrogen required for this massive industrial alchemy? We strip it out of natural gas.
Specifically methane.
So natural gas isn't just the power source for the fertilizer factory. It is the raw physical ingredient inside the fertilizer itself.
Yes.
And because the Middle East has vast reserves of cheap natural gas, they have become the global epicenter for fertilizer production.
Yeah.
Under normal conditions, 1/3 of all seaborne fertilizer on Earth originates there and passes through the Strait of Hormuz.
So shutting down that strait severs the nutrient pipeline for global agriculture.
The markets are screaming this exact reality right now. Urea futures, which are the financial contracts predicting the future price of this fertilizer, have spiked roughly 50% since the war began.
50%.
And this is happening precisely as the spring planting season is kicking off across much of the Northern Hemisphere.
A 50% spike in fertilizer costs forces a brutal calculation for farmers. Many simply cannot afford the input costs, so they use less fertilizer. And the math on that is absolute. Less fertilizer yields fewer crops per acre.
And the human toll translates directly from those lower yields. The World Food Program data in our sources projects that if this conflict extends through the second quarter, an additional 45 million people will face acute hunger.
35 million.
That is stacked on top of a baseline of 318 million people already in that critical category.
It creates an inescapable crisis because you cannot negotiate with biology. People have to eat.
Right. So from the agricultural layer, the shockwave moves into a seemingly bizarre, highly technical third layer. Helium and semiconductors.
Yeah, this one surprises people. When you mention helium, the immediate association is party balloons or blimps.
Right, squeaky voices.
Exactly. But its role in modern technology is absolute and largely irreplaceable.
The sources outline that helium is a non-negotiable component for advanced manufacturing, specifically semiconductors MRI machines, aerospace engineering, and fiber optics.
The reason helium is the linchpin here comes down to its unique physics. It has the lowest boiling point of any element, meaning it can achieve temperatures near absolute zero without freezing solid.
Absolute zero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is also completely inert. It doesn't react with other chemicals.
So how does a Middle Eastern war choke off the global supply of helium?
Well, because helium is predominantly harvested as a byproduct of processing natural gas.
Ah, back to natural gas.
Right. You extract the natural gas from the ground, and a tiny percentage of that gas stream is helium, which is then separated out. Qatar alone produces nearly 1/3 of the global helium supply.
So when Qatar's gas infrastructure is attacked, or the shipping lanes block the specialized cryogenic containers needed to transport it, 1/3 of the world's high-tech cooling capacity just vanishes.
Let's use an analogy to understand how this hits the tech sector. The semiconductor industry is essentially a hyper-advanced commercial bakery.
Okay, a bakery.
Yeah. You can have massive silos full of flour and sugar, which in this case are silicon wafers and multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants. You can have the best bakers in the world.
Right.
But if your supply of baking soda suddenly disappears, the entire operation freezes. You cannot bake the cake without that one specific chemical agent.
And in semiconductor fabrication, they use helium to cool the silicon wafers during the intense heat of the manufacturing process and to flush out other reactive gases that could contaminate the microscopic circuitry.
Exactly. There is a quote in the sources from an industry consultant discussing massive chip makers like TSMC and Samsung that frames this perfectly. They said, right now it's still sunny on the beach, but there's a tsunami coming.
Meaning the fabs are currently running on stored reserves of helium. Everything looks normal today. The chips are still rolling off the line.
But they can see the water receding. They know exactly how many days of inventory they hold in their tanks. Once those on-site buffers run dry, the lines will undergo hard starts. You cannot manufacture an AI processor without helium.
It's wild how connected this is. Okay, the fourth and final notable layer we need to unpack touches almost every physical object you interact with. Petrochemicals and plastics.
It is easy to view plastics as separate from the oil market because they don't look or smell like crude oil. But virtually all modern plastics are synthesized from fossil fuel derivatives, primarily a feedstock called naphtha.
Naphtha. Let's explain naphtha. When crude oil goes into a refinery, it gets heated up and separated into different components based on their boiling points.
Right.
You get gasoline, you get jet fuel, and you get naphtha, which is a highly versatile, highly flammable liquid mixture of hydrocarbons.
And Asia is the undisputed king of global plastics manufacturing, producing over half the world's supply. But to feed those massive chemical plants, they import over 60% of their naphtha directly from the Middle East.
Over 60%. So when those tankers stop arriving, the raw material pipeline for the entire packaging and manufacturing world dries up. The prices for basic plastic building blocks, polymers like polyethylene and polypropylene, have already jumped nearly 40%.
Which cascades into the cost of absolutely everything. The plastic syringe in a hospital, the dashboard of your car, the insulation around electrical wiring, the packaging keeping food sanitary.
It's everywhere. This is exactly how you trace global inflation. You start with a closed waterway in the Persian Gulf, and 3 months later, the cost to manufacture a plastic bottle, an MRI machine, and a loaf of bread has surged simultaneously.
It's a complete system shock.
So that brings us to our third section. Current practices. If you are looking at this unprecedented disruption across energy, food, technology, and manufacturing, across all these sectors, what are the firefighting measures? Like, how do global governments and multinational businesses actually attempt to survive a crisis of this velocity right now?
Well, the initial reflex is massive coordinated government intervention. They try to flood the market with liquidity, in this case physical liquid, to suppress the panic.
We saw this with the International Energy Agency orchestrating a massive, unprecedented move, a coordinated release of 400 million barrels of oil from government strategic reserves.
It is a historic intervention. To conceptualize that scale, 400 million barrels is literally an ocean of crude. In the United States, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is stored in massive underground salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana.
Wow, salt caverns.
Yeah. And pumping that much oil out and getting it onto the market requires immense logistical coordination.
Okay, but let me push back on this for a second. If we just released 400 million barrels, doesn't that solve the problem for now? I mean, if the Strait is blocking 20% of global supply, but we dump all this stored supply onto the market, shouldn't that stabilize things?
It creates a dangerous illusion of stability,
How so?
because you are conflating paper market prices with physical infrastructure. Yes, releasing those reserves acts as a massive shock absorber for prices today, but it is strictly a stopgap measure. Those salt caverns hold a finite amount of oil.
Right, they eventually run out.
Exactly. And while you are draining your emergency savings account, basically the fundamental structural problem, the damaged LNG facilities in Qatar, the closed strait, remains completely broken.
You can release reserves, but because physical infrastructure is damaged, the market cannot structurally recover until the strait opens and repairs are made.
Precisely. Once you deplete those strategic reserves, if the physical repairs aren't complete and the ship still cannot sail, you are left entirely exposed. You have fired your only silver bullet, and the werewolf is still standing there.
And financial traders know this. They do not wait for a complete shutdown or for reserves to run dry to start panicking. They price the risk aggressively and early.
A prime example is the maritime insurance market, primarily centered around Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee. When a conflict escalates, they instantly redraw the map of high-risk areas.
Right.
If a vessel owner wants to send a tanker anywhere near the Arabian Sea, the war risk insurance premium skyrockets overnight.
A voyage that cost $50,000 to insure last month might cost over $1 million to insure today. And that $1 million premium is immediately baked into the price of whatever is inside the ship.
Which triggers a psychological shift in the corporate world. The transition from just-in-time logistics to defensive hoarding.
Yes, the bullwhip effect. If a plastics manufacturer in Vietnam hears that naphtha supplies might be choked off for 6 months, they don't buy what they need for next week. They defensively hoard inputs. They buy every available metric ton they can find on the spot market at any price to ensure their assembly line doesn't die.
But when every manufacturer does that simultaneously, they artificially tighten the supply even further, turning a localized shortage into a global famine.
J.P. Morgan analysts provided a brilliant framework for understanding how this hoarding and shortage travels. They called it a rolling supply disruption.
It is a phenomenal way to visualize the mechanics. It is not an explosion that damages the whole globe in a single second. It is a tsunami wave propagating outward from the epicenter. It moves strictly westward.
Okay, let's track the timeline. Asia feels it first, which is what we're seeing now. They are physically closest and most heavily reliant on the direct maritime routes.
Then, according to the timeline and the sources, the wave hits Africa heavily by early April. Africa is particularly vulnerable to the secondary shock waves, the fertilizer and the food.
Right. They import the finished agricultural products that Asia and the Middle East are suddenly struggling to produce.
Exactly. By mid-April, the wave crashes into Europe. Europe has spent the last few years aggressively decoupling from Russian pipeline gas, replacing it with seaborne LNG, heavily reliant on Qatar.
And with Qatar's output crippled, Europe is suddenly scrambling to secure energy to keep its industrial base alive.
And finally, standing at the very end of the line is the United States.
Which brings up a big question. Why is the U.S. last in line? Is it just geographic distance?
It is a combination of distance and domestic production. The U.S. produces massive amounts of its own crude oil and natural gas in places like the Permian Basin. It does not rely on a tanker navigating the Strait of Hormuz to keep the lights on in Chicago or fuel the cars in Dallas.
So direct physical shortages of fuel in the U.S. are highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely, yes.
But the U.S. is absolutely not insulated from the financial reality, right? They will still feel the pain.
Oh, without a doubt. Because oil is a globally traded fungible commodity. If 20% of the global supply vanishes, the global price doubles. American producers will sell their oil at that new, doubled global price.
So the American consumer still pays the staggering premium at the pump, even if the molecule of gas was extracted in Texas.
Exactly. Furthermore, the U.S. economy relies on the global supply chain for finished goods. The oil might be domestic, but the microchips, the plastics, the car parts, all of those are imported from Asia. The U.S. imports the inflation.
And the attempts to rewire these supply chains on the fly are excruciatingly difficult. Which brings me to analogy 2.
Go for it.
Supply chains are like a tightly woven sweater. You pull one invisible thread in the Middle East, say helium or naphtha, and suddenly an MRI machine factory in Germany or a toy manufacturer in Asia completely unravels.
That's a perfect way to look at it, because while supply chains try to adapt by finding new suppliers, like, say, buying from the U.S. or Russia, adaptation is never free. It comes with immense friction. Think of global logistics not as a map with lines drawn on it, but as a massive, deeply carved river system. For decades, the trade has flowed through the deepest, most efficient channels, like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
When you suddenly dam up the main river, the water doesn't just neatly hop over to another channel, it floods. It forces its way into tiny, inefficient side streams. It carves up the landscape, creating massive logistical delays.
So if a European factory can't get petrochemicals from the Middle East, they might have to buy them from a supplier in the US or South America. But they don't have existing contracts. They don't have ships positioned on those routes. The ports might not have the capacity to handle the sudden surge in volume.
You are dealing with entirely new geopolitical negotiations and new trade-offs. You eventually get the petrochemicals, but it takes 3 times as long and costs twice as much.
So these current scrambling practices are expensive and stressful, which leads us directly to the ultimate question, our final section. Future implications. Where does this leave the average consumer and the global economy in the long run?
Well, the foundational takeaway from the sources is that we must decouple how we view energy inflation versus food inflation, because their long-term trajectories are radically different.
We touch on this, but it requires a deeper look, because people can survive energy inflation by adapting, right?
Yep.
It's a behavioral tax.
Right. If the cost of gasoline sustains at $10 a gallon, humans adapt. We carpool, we utilize public transit, logistics companies consolidate trucking routes.
Airlines optimize flight paths.
Exactly. It is a massive drag on economic growth, but modern societies have mechanisms to absorb and adapt to fuel shocks temporarily.
But food inflation is fundamentally different. It operates on an unforgiving biological axis. It affects everyone, every week.
You cannot innovate your way out of requiring 2,000 calories a day. When the cost of basic grains, driven by fertilizer shortages, skyrockets, it acts as the most regressive tax possible.
Meaning poorer, import-dependent states are hit hardest.
Yes, because they lack the wealth to subsidize costs. They do not have the treasury reserves to step in and subsidize the cost of bread for their populations. They simply get outbid by wealthier nations for the dwindling global food supply.
And this transforms a regional military conflict into a global humanitarian and political crisis.
Right.
Because historically, sudden spikes in staple food prices are the primary catalyst for mass social unrest.
Absolutely.
So why does the global market seem particularly frozen right now? Like, what paralyzes the global effort to mitigate these threats?
It is the psychological fog of the conflict. The Barclays analysts highlighted in the sources describe the current market environment quite literally as a dense fog.
A dense fog.
Yes. They point directly to inconsistent and opaque communication from the Trump administration regarding the strategic parameters of the war.
Meaning there is no clear articulation of the war's objectives, the anticipated duration, the potential expansion drawing in other regional actors, or what the diplomatic off-ramps might even entail.
And this is a lethal environment for capital markets. It goes back to how risk is managed. Markets can adapt to bad news, but they cannot easily adapt to unclear news.
Because they can't price it.
Exactly. If a company knows definitively that the Strait of Hormuz will be closed for exactly 1 year, their analysts build a spreadsheet. They calculate the exact financial penalty of routing all their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to the transit time. They adjust their prices, they take the margin hit, and the gears keep turning.
But when the news is unclear, when they don't know if the strait will reopen next month, or if the war will expand to involve Saudi oil fields tomorrow, they freeze.
Uncertainty is the enemy of capital expenditure. Uncertainty forces defensive behavior. A manufacturer will not break ground on a new billion-dollar facility if they cannot confidently model their raw material costs over the next 5 years.
A shipping company will halt orders for new vessels. They stop hiring.
And to insulate themselves from this unknown future volatility, corporations simply raise prices across the board today. They build a massive buffer into their margins, and they pass projected costs directly onto you, the consumer.
Which leads to the permanent cost of disruption. Even if a miraculous diplomatic ceasefire is signed tomorrow, or a worst-case global supply collapse is avoided, the damage is already done.
The world is locked into a long period of elevated costs, lowered efficiency, and weakened confidence.
The era of hyper-optimized, frictionless globalization has taken a permanent hit. Corporations and governments have stared into the abyss of just-in-time manufacturing, and they realize the tightrope walk was done without a net.
Supply chains are going to be fundamentally redesigned. The mandate is shifting from how can we get this component as cheaply as possible to how can we guarantee we get this component no matter what happens.
And building redundancy into a system inherently destroys efficiency. It requires holding massive physical inventories, building duplicate factories in politically safe regions, utilizing more expensive domestic labor.
It means structurally higher inflation is going to be the baseline reality for the foreseeable future.
So this basically proves that in a deeply interconnected modern world, there is no such thing as an isolated regional war.
Absolutely not.
Well, to bring this entirely full circle, let's look at what we've covered. We started at a blocked 21-mile waterway in the Middle East, and we followed those shockwaves through stranded crude oil supertankers, Asian manufacturing curbs, global food supplies threatened by fertilizer chemistry, the helium microchips in our phones, and the plastics in our homes.
It is a profound, entirely impartial demonstration of how aggressively interconnected our daily survival is to regions we rarely think about.
The story is obviously still moving at a rapid pace. So to help you critically evaluate the news as it continues to break, here are 3 specific questions to explore on your own to deepen your understanding.
Things to keep an eye on.
Exactly. First, how are major tech companies currently attempting to redesign semiconductor manufacturing to rely less on rare byproducts like Middle Eastern helium?
That's a huge one.
Right. Second, will the intense shock to global food security accelerate a permanent shift away from natural gas-based fertilizers toward alternative agricultural practices? And third, how does the rolling nature of this disruption shift geopolitical power? Like if the U.S. feels the physical pain lasts due to domestic production, does that give them unique leverage or just a false sense of security?
Those are critical questions, and if you connect this to the bigger picture, the true vulnerability of the modern world isn't necessarily a lack of resources, but the extreme efficiency of how we transport them.
We optimize too much.
Yes, we built a global economy optimized for peace and profit, and right now, we are discovering exactly how fragile that makes us during a war.
Wow, so what does this all mean? It means the next time you pay for groceries or upgrade your phone, you'll know exactly the invisible global journey and the risks behind it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.